Today we're going to cover a couple of topics all in one go. We're going to look closely at the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, but at the same time we're going to consider causes of why every other classical empire collapsed and why these collapses bring the time period that we've been studying, the classical period, to an end. In doing so, we're going to be raising the question, are empires, by definition, doomed to fall? Remember that we've learned about classical empires as large, centralized states that expand by conquest and therefore rule over diverse populations. And it's the expanding by conquest part that becomes tricky at a certain point. Because, as we learned, it creates this sort of vicious cycle, right? You have a civilization that's thriving, it's growing, cool. You then need more resources. And one of the easier ways to get more resources, especially if you have a big, strong army, is to conquer other people's land and take their stuff. So successful empires do that. They rule over the people that they've conquered, they build their civilization further, and then they need more resources, which means more conquest. I'm going to have the image of a rubber band being stretched on a bunch of slides in this presentation because that's really the best visual for this problem that this creates for empires. As empires gather more land, they look like they're getting stronger, and yet they are stretched thinner and thinner until eventually they snap. Another theme that is going to come into play in this talk, in this class, is the relationship between people in settled civilizations and the nomads outside of their borders. We've learned that people in settled civilizations tended to look down on people who weren't them, right? They called people who weren't civilized barbarians, and that was a very pejorative sort of word. But we've also learned that settled civilizations benefited from the existence of nomadic peoples, particularly as relates to long-distance trade. Pastoral nomads live in harsh climates, and they're used to moving around. That's kind of the definition of their whole lifestyle. And so they're key to long-distance trade, providing the connections between classical empires by literally moving goods from one empire to the next through this difficult territory to live in and move around in. However, this is a double-edged sword because harsh climates are not exactly the most stable places to live. They can be vulnerable to changes in climate, and generally, tough people tend to live here because living here tends to be kind of tough. So, when, for example, there's a drought in Central Asia, forcing tribes like the Huns and later on in history the Mongols out for their own survival, you've got a situation where you have like really tough people with nothing left to lose that can very quickly become very effective conquerors. Another thing that comes into play is just the advantage that a nomad would have face to face with a civilization, which seems weird. We think of civilizations as these big, strong places with like really organized armies and like maybe giant city walls. And that's true. But nomads have the advantage of not playing by conventional rules. And civilization really, as a concept, is all about rules and order, right? So they can be faster, nomads can, I mean. They can be unconventional in their tactics of war, which gives them an element of surprise. They can be very persistent, especially if they are attacking civilization in order to survive, and they have less to lose. So weakened empires are vulnerable to these kinds of attacks. All of this is to say that the short-term cause of the fall of classical empires, the immediate thing that does it, is attacks by barbarians, who the civilized people would have called barbarians. But if we're going to understand why these classical civilizations, one after another, fell to these kinds of attacks, we have to understand why they were weakened to begin with. So this involves an examination of the difference between long-term causes and short-term causes of an event. In order to understand any event in history and in life, the best approach is to take the complex approach and look beyond the short-term, direct, event-based cause and see what long-term, indirect causes also contributed to it. A long-term or indirect cause is a trend that has been around for a long time that overall develops an effect. Long-term causes can be structural problems or conditions. They can be processes or ideas that are developing that eventually cause trouble. And long-term causes provide the context that makes it possible for a short-term cause to have a big effect. These kinds of things add up over time, and they're multiple. For example, if I wanted to explain why I passed world history with a high GPA, I could point to just doing well on a unit test. But really, if I really wanted to explain it, long-term or indirect causes fed into that result. Those could include having good study habits, generally paying attention in class, taking notes every day, completing the reading, so on and so forth. Those things together lead to a short-term cause having an effect. Short-term or direct causes are immediate. They're usually events with a date that you can put on them, and they act as a trigger that set long-term causes into motion to produce an effect. On the right of this slide, if you want to pause the video, you'll see an example of multiple long-term causes of the fall of Rome, followed by the immediate cause, barbarian invasion, and the effect. We're going to go over a little bit more of a simplified, streamlined version because failing states follow patterns. This is true now, it's been true in the past. And in explaining why the Roman Empire specifically declined and fell, we can also look at general causes that explain the decline and fall of the other classical civilizations that we've studied too. These are usually like 100-year-old processes in the works, especially like the long-term causes. Right? Between 200 and 600 CE, all of the classical civilizations fell, but it wasn't just like from one day to the next. These things had been in the works over time. As always in history, if we can look for general patterns through which to understand specific cases, learning history and kind of understanding why things tend to happen works a lot better. So we're going to go over general patterns first. Then I'm going to kind of show you how it worked in Rome, and then we will finally end on the key points. In terms of why classical empires, these big, strong, like behemoth states who had existed for hundreds and hundreds of years, why they fell, we can look to several kinds of long-term, general, indirect causes that weakened these empires. First and foremost is overexpansion. When empires get too much territory to defend and govern, they become weak because their resources are stretched thin. Add to that consistent conflict with potential invaders like nomadic or quote-unquote barbarian tribes outside the borders. That weakens the empire further because the empire is using military resources to defeat these attacks. Third, just as important, failure of leadership. When political leaders begin to focus on wealth instead of the needs of the state, you can call that corruption. And often the results end up being not great for the state, however great they might be for the specific leader who is trying to get wealthy. Similarly, internal corruption. When you have social inequality growing to a point where it's not sustainable, where the rich are just getting richer and the poor are getting poorer to dangerous levels, and you add to that a lack of new conquests, which means like a lack of external money being imported into the empire, you get instability inside the empire. All of those things tended to weaken classical empires over time, making it possible for the short-term direct cause of the collapse of these empires, a violent event, barbarian invasion, as it turns out, to have an effect. When these empires collapse, you get new states emerging in the vacuum, often weaker states, which means less safety, which means less long-distance trade. And we'll see how that played out in Rome. The Roman Empire, we have to remember, had been in existence for hundreds of years, starting in 27 BCE. But really, it started even before that, when it was still a republic that had began to expand by conquest. When you look at the map of the Roman Empire, consider that one person ruled that entire territory. Consider that after Augustus, that one person had full power and no separation of powers to limit their ability to make bad decisions. So eventually, this became problematic. First, overexpansion means like conquering more territory than you can handle, making the border of the empire really, really, really big. And when you overexpand, you create problems that unstable, inept governments are unable to deal with. Governing the entire Roman Empire would have been difficult for a wonderful emperor. Unfortunately, Rome was in short supply of wonderful emperors, especially towards the end. It's a story of like assassination upon like bad decision, just a disaster, the Roman emperors towards the end. So, like elections, bad emperors have consequences, and the consequences are you end up with way more complex work than, bad emperors can deal with. In Rome specifically, they tried to deal with this problem in two ways. One, Constantine, remember, converted to Christianity and tried to use that religion to unite an increasingly diverse population. And two, they actually ended up splitting the Roman Empire in half, so that the West was governed by one person based in Rome. The East was governed separately, with a capital in Constantinople, named after Constantine. This split is important because when we talk about the Roman Empire falling, we're mostly talking about the West, and I'll get to that in a second. The general trend, though, right? Overexpansion creates bigger problems. One of those problems is that the military is increasingly spread too thin. Look at the size of that border. It is an enormous problem to get enough soldiers to watch that border. Getting soldiers is hard because you want people who you can trust with weapons. So you can't just pick anybody. So getting soldiers to man that whole border is difficult. And it would be difficult even if there was peace at that entire border. But of course there wasn't. Right? So like, how do you even develop an army that's that big? And then how do you pay it? How do you feed all of those people without conquering more land or overtaxing your citizens? Paying the army is really important. They're all the big tough dudes with weapons, so you have to keep them happy. And increasingly that becomes unsustainable for Rome, leading to the Roman military being spread entirely too thin. And a military that is spread entirely too thin is completely unable to resist invasion. When we talk about invasion from the barbarian tribes, in the case of Rome, we're actually talking about two things. The first was the Germanic tribes outside of Rome's border, just under normal circumstances that like sometimes they fought. These tribes would have been like big and tough and scary anyway. Compounding the problem, a drought in Mongolia, in modern-day Mongolia, in Central Asia, pushed a big, tough, scary tribe called the Huns out for survival. Some of them went west towards Europe. And because they were even scarier, even more effective nomads than the ones that had already been in Europe, they pushed the Germanic tribes into Rome's borders. So, when the military spread too thin, it's not going to handle this well when it happens on a large scale. And it began to happen on a large, large scale in the last 100 or so years of Rome. So that meant multiple barbarian invasions of Rome, multiple times when people or tribes invaded the empire, sacked it, so like took a bunch of stuff and then destroyed what they could. And, that weakened the empire over time. And this happened over and over and over again from Germanic tribes that you may or may not have heard of, like the Vandals and the Goths and the Visigoths and the Huns and the Ostrogoths, lots of different kinds of Goths. It's cool to look at the pictures that we have here too. These paintings were obviously not painted at the time, but they definitely convey the sense that you have civilization being just completely overrun by, well, by barbarians, by people who are brutish and uncivilized, and who are pretty willing to destroy everything. And roughly that's what happened over and over and over again. Barbarian Germanic tribes sacked Rome repeatedly, each time weakening the empire further. Until the last time. The last barbarian invasion of Rome was in 476, during which time the barbarian leader Odacer deposed the child emperor Romulus Augustulus, and then became king of Italy himself. After this date, there was no more Western Roman Empire. In the West, there were barbarian kingdoms where like the different tribes had settled, with the Visigoths kind of towards the south of France and Spain, Odacer's kingdom in Italy, the Ostrogoths sort of northeastish of Italy, the Franks, the Saxons, the Juts, and from these different little tribal kingdoms, we get the modern European states. They don't like being called barbaric, though, so don't tell, French people that they originate with barbaric people. They don't like that very much. Anyway, I digress. Multiple independent kingdoms were established where the Roman Empire used to be. That means that we call this region something different now, right? We used to be able to refer to all of Western Europe as just the Roman Empire. Now, we need to start calling it Western Europe because it's home to multiple independent kingdoms. In the East had kind of a special situation because of the location of its capital. Constantinople was a rich trading city, and the East survived. Changed its name though, so the Eastern Roman Empire became known as the Byzantine Empire. From all of this mess, just about the only thing to survive from Rome was Christianity. Every other hallmark of Roman civilization, including the language, was lost in this conflict. And so we get a situation where the Roman Empire kind of very poetically began with a guy named Romulus, ended with a guy named Romulus, and in between you had Rome building amazing accomplishments of civilization by conquering more and more empire land, more and more territory. And then this barbarian invasion completely destroyed it. The population of Rome tanked. People ran away to the countryside, kind of in fear. And you get a huge rupture in history. The civilization built and prized by the Romans with their philosophy and their rhetoric and their high culture and engineering, it was all lost. And something entirely new takes its place in the West, sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages. I'm repeating this because it's kind of hard to overstate the impact that this change would have had on the people who lived there at the time. The Roman Empire had existed for like 500 years. It was a super strong mega state, centrally ruled, that had ordered the lives of people in that territory for all of living memory. And then it was gone. The Western European region had to rebuild from scratch. So this caused a pretty big rupture in history. At this point, we've covered enough of this pattern that you should be able to summarize the following in your notes pretty well. For the decline and fall of classical empires, which leads to the decline and end of the classical period itself, we can note the general pattern. By around the year 550 CE, all of the classical civilizations had fallen because of this general series of events. They expanded, creating a bigger border, which made more land to defend, more people to feed, more rebellions to put down. This turned into a problem of overexpansion. They bit off more than they can chew. That rubber band is about to snap. This weakens the empire by creating military and financial difficulties that it can't manage. This is essentially the long-term cause of the decline of all of the classical empires. In the case of Rome, overexpansion is definitely the primary long-term cause. Short-term, the Roman Empire fell because of the event, barbarian invasions by Germanic tribes. In terms of the effects in the West were huge. This was a huge break in history, meaning a huge difference between what existed and what came after. The fall of Rome in Western Europe was the end of a centralized superstate that had structured life for 500 years. After the collapse, in place of this one state that was centrally ruled, you had dozens of kings ruling small independent states, like warlords, really, is what I want you to picture. If you watch like The Last Kingdom or Vikings, like that's kind of the climate that we're moving into for the next time period. To refer to this region moving forward, use Western Europe now instead of Rome. In the East, that half of the Roman Empire survived, but became known as the Byzantine Empire. And what we think of when we think of Roman civilization was just lost to the West. One continuity, however, was that Europeans largely remained Christian, and Christianity became the dominant religion in the region. Turning to the Han Dynasty in China, we can see the same kind of pattern at work. Long-term causes of collapse of the Han Dynasty involved recurring conflict with nomadic tribes, plus increasing government corruption and high taxation, which leads to internal conflict. Specifically, the peasants did not enjoy being told to starve. And that led to a weakening of the empire, which over time made it possible for the Huns to invade, abandoned bits of that Great Wall that they built. The effects of the fall of the Han Dynasty, however, are a little different than in Rome. The Han Dynasty also broke into smaller states, but despite some chaos after the fall of the Han, there wasn't a permanent disruption of Chinese civilization in the same way as experienced in the West. So like language remained the same, culture remained the same, Confucian ideology made a comeback. Bureaucratic organization for the state continued as well. So you can't always just compare, you also have to contrast. Even though the causes of the falls of both of these empires are similar, the effects are pretty different. In the West, a complete break in history, something entirely new comes after the fall of Rome. In China, you get the end of the empire and the emergence of smaller states, but Chinese civilization lives on.